Good evening, and a very warm welcome to all of you. Before I introduce Professor Timothy Garton, let me just do the housekeeping points. This meeting is on the record. I'm assured that you get the best view if you use speaker view on your system. Please can I ask you all to mute yourselves? And if you wish to ask a question, please either use the chat button or raise a virtual hand, and you will be called, and when you're called, you will be live. Now, Timothy, thank you very much for speaking to us. I'm again, for the second time, we hope there will be others. It's a very great privilege to have you with us, to give us your time. For those of you who don't know, and I doubt there are many who don't know, Timothy is a professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford, the Isaiah Berlin Professorial Fellow at St. Antony's, and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. He is also a prolific, distinguished, and much awarded writer, whose most recent book, which I personally recommend, is Homelands of Personal History of Europe. Timothy is going to talk to us this evening about UK-EU relations from Putin to Trump. And when he's spoken, we will have a Q&A session. Timothy, the floor is yours.
Many thanks. Great pleasure to be with you. And I'm delighted to hear there is still something called the Conservative European Forum. That's a very encouraging sign. Let me start by saying that I think we can be pretty sure that the next British Prime Minister, whatever he's called, whether he's called Keir Starmer or Keir Starmer, will face something between a force 6 security crisis in Europe and a force 8 or 9 security crisis in Europe. And oddly enough, one of the few directions in which that creates an opportunity is for UK-EU relations. As they said in the Obama administration during the global financial crisis, a crisis too good to waste. Now, the key ingredients of the security crisis are, first of all, most obviously, Ukraine. I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago for the 5th time since the beginning of the full-scale war. And I have to tell you, it's going badly. We have to be very clear about this. 2 leading military experts closely connected to the Ukrainian armed forces both used the same formula. They said, Ukraine is on a trajectory to lose. Not immediately, but a trajectory to lose. It's still winnable if we do more and they do more, but it's on the trajectory to lose. The second element is the rise of populists of the hard right. Don't be reassured by the actual figures in the European Parliament, the aggregate figures, the fact that the EPP is still on top. The shocking results in the core West European member states of the EU, above all France. More than 30% for the Rassemblement National. No party has got that for more than 40 years. The chaos being caused by Macron's view, in my view, of hubris in calling the national parliamentary elections, it's entirely possible that 3 days after our election, the French national election will produce a majority for the Rassemblement National. So we would be boats passing in the night. But even if it doesn't, it's going to produce a very complicated political situation in which Macron, who is, after all, one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine in the EU, will be preoccupied with his domestic affairs. But the result in Germany was not good either. The fact that the AfD, which is a more extreme party than the Rassemblement National, got a larger percentage of the vote than Chancellor Scholz's Social Democrats or the Free Democrats or the Greens is quite shocking. And that too has implications for support for Ukraine. The Netherlands, Geert Wilders' party did very well. And of course, Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia in Italy. So that's a second element in the European crisis. And the third element is, of course, the prospect of a victory by Donald Trump on the 5th of November. The very real prospect. I have to say, I was in Normandy for the D-Day anniversary, and in the big international commemoration event, you had in the front row these magnificent old veterans on the right and the world leaders on the left. But looking at it, one thought for a moment that Joe Biden had strayed from the veteran side to the world leader side. I mean, he really did look like grandpa, and that's a real problem. So somewhere between 4.6 and 4.8 security crisis in the second half of this year, opportunity for the UK. At the moment, I cannot emphasize enough how shockingly absent Britain is from continental European discussions. I spend a lot of time in places where French speak to Germans or Poles to Spaniards or Italians to Czechs, and Britain is virtually never mentioned. Even, for example, in the discussion of a European nuclear deterrent. So that there's a major challenge there. Now, what we have from Labour is basically two ways forward. One is the super cautious, incremental path, which is spelled out in the Labour manifesto, just published. It says, we will be confident in our status outside of the EU, but a leading nation in Europe once again. Does that sound familiar? And then it says we must make Brexit work. There will be no return to single market, customs union, or freedom of movement. And then it says, I quote, instead, Labour will work to improve the UK's trade and investment relationship with the EU by tearing down unnecessary barriers to trade. Which barriers and how you tear them down, question mark. We will seek to negotiate a veterinary agreement to prevent unnecessary border checks, help our touring artists, secure a mutual recognition agreement for professional qualifications to help open up markets for UK service exporters. Next paragraph, Labour will seek an ambitious new UK-EU security pact. So an incredibly modest, incremental approach, which makes Mr. Putin look bold. I can tell you what the response to that would be, because I've tried this out in many continental capitals. The response would be, great, we love the offer of the Security Pact and cooperation on defense and foreign policy and supporting Ukraine. Wonderful, we're all with you on that. All that other stuff, go and talk to the European Commission. The Commission speaks for the 27 member states. You're a third country. That's it. And you wouldn't get very far. The second approach, which is being canvassed inside Labour's top leadership, was laid out by David Lammy in his Foreign Affairs article, which some of you may have read, and it says that to address the problem, the UK must seek a new geopolitical partnership with the EU, a security pact that drives closer coordination across a wide variety of military, economic, climate, health, cyber, and energy security issues. And in my view, this is the only effective approach that a new government could take. That's the only approach that will change the conversation on the continent. Framing it as a conversation about the security crisis. But what is not security these days? And so all those other issues, which in the manifesto version, and I think the Keir Starmer office version, are being presented as separate sort of economic issues, are part of this larger conversation. And so security is not just military and security, it's diplomatic, it's intelligence, but it's also energy cooperation. It's also democratic security, so combating disinformation. It's tech. It's and it's economic security. And framing that in this much larger picture is entirely doable within the red lines laid out by Labour, so no return to single market and customs union. And in my view, that is the way to go. That is the chance that is there to be seized. And if you think about the choreography, very soon after our next prime minister goes into number 10, shall we call him Keir Starmer, you have the Washington summit of the NATO. So that's the first opportunity. The manifesto is very strong on NATO. Then you have the European political community meeting in Churchill's birthplace, Blenheim Palace. Great opportunity to lay out the big picture, a larger reset between the UK and the EU. And then I would say somewhat later in the year, and are very much depending what happens in the United States, you would have the opportunity to lay the case out more extensively and in more detail and with more detailed preparation in some continental capital. So in Berlin or in Paris or in the European Parliament or wherever it might be. Probably after November the 5th, because the way that is framed obviously depends very much on the US election result. Now, what would be the reaction to this? I don't want to raise too high hopes. I put this to an audience in Paris just 10 days ago, and there was, I have to say, a degree of skepticism. That's all very nice, but we have so much else on our plate. And we have to fight our populists, and we have Ukraine, and we have the Green Deal, and we have the Ukraine and the prospect of the US, and so on and so forth. So that it wasn't an overwhelmingly, yes, wonderful, we'll seize that opportunity with both hands. And I think we all know about cakeism. France has its own version of cakeism, which is we do political economy, we do the EU with Germany and the rest of the EU, and we do security and defense bilaterally with the UK, right? Lancaster House and all of that. And so I think there would be quite a strong temptation for our continental partners to continue to take the offer on the security, the defense and security front, and push the economic issues across to the Commission and to a community-wide approach to us as a third country. But there would be a much better chance of having a joined-up conversation with some connections being made between these dossiers if we presented it as a larger package, as a reset. And let me give you one example. Defense procurement, right? So this is obviously a crucial issue, both for building up European defense, even if it's as a European pillar of NATO, and for support for Ukraine. There's a very strong tendency led by France to say when it comes to European defense procurement, it should be inside the EU. And that's going to be extremely difficult for Britain if Britain continues to take a leading role in supporting Ukraine, but there are no contracts coming back to our rather big defense industry. So that would be one area where there might be, significant linkages, I think, to be made. So I'm not going to pretend for a moment that it's good to have somewhere between Force 6 and Force 8 or 9 security crisis in Europe. But I think there is an opportunity there if a new government is prepared to seize that opportunity and offer a major reset framed in the right way. And I think there would be significant governments. I mean, for example, Olaf Scholz's German government, which is after all a social democrat-led government, Mette Frederiksen in Denmark, who's been very, very strong on supporting Ukraine, would be another person to think about. Spain too, and who knows what will come out of the French elections. So that's what just very few words I wanted to say in introduction, and I look forward very much to questions which I'd welcome right across the board, also across other things happening in European politics, Eastern Europe, Germany, France, and so on. I think you're on mute.
Well, I've unmuted myself. Thank you very much indeed. Let me take the chairman's advantage of asking you a couple of questions before colleagues kick in. In the light of what you said, which I very broadly agree, it seems to me a great shame that this general election has not got defence and security and the threat it poses high up on its agenda from either party. Because without public support, achieving what you have outlined will be particularly difficult.
Yes. I mean, interestingly, if you look at the Labour manifesto, it is quite strong on that. It's quite forceful on that issue. And of course, there is still a major cross-party consensus on Ukraine, isn't there? So the problem here is much, much smaller. I mean, just to give you a comparison, in the case of Germany, 1 in 5, one in 4 German voters voted for parties that are advocating quote unquote peace negotiations for Ukraine, pretty much peace on Russian terms. So that's a problem I think we don't have. But where I agree with you is that the sort of sense of existential threat, the sense it's actually something that's our security, which is at stake, is pretty much absent from everybody's campaign. In fact, I don't think there's any single party that's putting it front and center, which is one reason it's a very boring campaign.
Yeah, that's a dangerous one. Oliver, I know you have to go shortly. Would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Liz. Yes, I would. Thank you. But in the awful event of a second Trump term, should the UK use its leverage in the special relationship, which I hope even Trump would respect, to constrain some of the threat to European stability, which I think would result inevitably from some sort of Trump-Putin pact on Ukraine?
So, can I say something absolutely heretical? Am I allowed to say something heretical?
Definitely. Encourage, Timothy.
Quite a long time ago, I heard Helmut Schmidt, who was very, very sarcastic. He was known as Schmidt the Lip, say, the special relationship is so special, only one side knows it exists. And perhaps a slight exaggeration, but I think we shouldn't overestimate our influence, I have to say, particularly after Brexit. In addition to which, of course, the likely government is Labour, and Labour's close relationship is with the Democrats, not with the Trumpians. I mean, Lamy, interestingly enough, has actually been meeting some Trumpians, so they've been trying. So I think our ability to do that would, in fact, be quite limited, unless we can make the following argument hit home. In the United States, the conversation about foreign policy is all about China. So Elbridge Colby, influential voice in the Republican side, is saying we have to pull back, forget about Ukraine, pull back from Europe because we have to concentrate on China and Taiwan. So if we can nail the argument that the best way to deter Xi Jinping from having a go at Taiwan is to show him what happened to Putin when he had a go at Ukraine, that I think has the best chance of keeping the United States more engaged in Europe. At the same time, second point, if we take the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which is, so to speak, the moderately extreme version of a Trump presidency, what they say is we, the United States, should maintain the nuclear umbrella over Europe, but draw down our conventional forces. And so I think we should be actively preparing with our European partners to build up our own conventional defenses in the European pillar of NATO. And I think that's good. And by the way, spending some of the money needed on the US defense industry, which is a great argument for Trump. He likes the idea that we're buying American. And so I think shaping it in that way, on the one hand, making the argument about China, on the other hand, we're doing more for our own defense, we're spending some of the money in the US, and it's also a good way to work more closely with our European partners, because they'd be keen on building up our conventional defenses too.
Trump will still need a European ally, won't he? So surely he won't abandon.
But here, let me say something quite sobering for you. It's not necessarily going to be us. Because I think what's going to happen if Trump is elected is that there will be a party of Trump in Europe. And the leader of that party will be Viktor Orban in Hungary, who, as many of you know, is an absolute hero to the American right. Tucker Carlson going to interview him in Budapest. Marine Le Pen would belong to the party of Trump. Geert Wilders would belong to the party of Trump. And by the way, Giorgia Meloni might well go that way, right, if it was a President Trump. So actually, I think he would have much closer, so to speak, ideological partners ready to be the party of Trump in continental Europe. It wouldn't necessarily be us.
I think that's a very valuable insight, although I suggest were he to pick Orban, he might be short of any other European partners, at least.
Watch out for Meloni. Watch out for Meloni.
I agree with you, which is why I didn't name her. I'm abusing my role. Peter Bassett. Peter, good evening.
Good evening. Sorry, I'll put my camera on. There we go. Mr. Garton, thank you for that. I was already in a sober, reflective move, having done some campaigning recently, and you've put me in an even more one. I was just going to ask, well, when Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, I thought that the Ukrainians, brave though they were, would last 6 weeks, the amount that France roughly lasted in 1940. In fact, they've lasted over 2 years, and much to my amazement, they have, despite disparities in manpower and shortage of weapons from time to time and ammunition, they have inflicted serious losses on the Russians. If, say, President Trump, there was also actually at the start of the war, this theory that Russia wouldn't want to occupy the whole of Ukraine because it was just too big. How do you think, say, if Trump got in, a sort of settlement, in inverted commas, of the Ukrainian war would pan out? Would it involve Ukraine surrendering unconditionally, or would there be some sort of division of the territory, or what would happen?
So first of all, on the military side, I mean, the Ukrainian resistance has been extraordinary, but they're very exhausted. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is 43. I've talked to the frontline soldiers, and the energy infrastructure is being just hammered. It has less than half the generating capacity that it had at the beginning of the war. So it's being ground down, and Russia has converted to a war economy. It has good relations with India and China and so on. So it has lots of economic partners, and it is just grinding away. So make no mistake, despite the heroic resistance of the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have great difficulty with conscription. Very big. Wherever I went, there were stories of you can't get taxi drivers because they don't want to be picked up for conscription, or, a newspaper editor saying his younger colleagues don't want to come in, they want to work from home because they might be picked up on the way to work. So that, that there were big difficulties. So Ukraine could still win, but it needs to do more, and above all, we need to do more ammunition, more weapons, more training, and so on. Russia controls close to 1/5 of the territory of Ukraine. And whatever the deal might be, and it's not absolutely clear that Putin will take the deal, because Putin thinks he's winning. So he might say, I'm going to go on and try and get Odessa. But if there were a deal, it would be on the basis of a territorial division, right? So a territory the size of Portugal and Slovenia put together, I mean, a huge territory, would remain under Russian occupation. And the problem there is that that would be seen by every single Ukrainian as a defeat, right? You lost the country. These are places where millions of Ukrainians lived. The country would be demoralized. It would be depopulated. Instead of the wives and children who are still with us now going back to rejoin the husbands would come to join the wives and children in Britain or Germany or Poland or wherever. And the politics would become bitterly acrimonious. There's already resentment against the West. There's already a lot of criticism of Zelensky at home. It would become absolutely bitter, so that Putin would not only have occupied that territory, he would be some way to achieving his goal of a dysfunctional Ukraine, right, which is his other goal. So that's, there are quite a few people in the West who think, well, maybe somewhere in there's a deal we can take, quote unquote, land for peace. But I think people are underestimating the sort of political, social, psychological impact of it in Ukraine itself, the fact that it would be seen as defeat. And by the way, Putin could sell it as victory. Putin could absolutely sell it as victory at home, because he explains it in historical terms. And so what he would say is, I have reconquered Novorossiya, New Russia, which is those parts of what is now Ukraine that were basically taken over by Catherine the Great in the 18th century. So that would be very bad news for us. And I think next stop, not next stop Estonia, but next stop Moldova.
Yeah.
There is possibly, for example, if Russia hang on to the Donbass, the heart of the Donbass, and Crimea, and Ukraine got NATO membership, that looks like a victory to most Ukrainians. So it's not that there isn't any compromise to be made, but the compromise that's on offer at the moment with the current territorial division is a defeat for Ukraine. And by the way, in the eyes of the rest of the world, also a defeat for the West, because in the eyes of the rest of the world, this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's a war between Russia and us.
Thank you.
I can't see at the moment. Ian Morling, I know you have a question which I think fits in behind Peter's. You
Good.
there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Ian.
Tim, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Pleasure.
Russia's historic attitude is obviously the backdrop to all of this. So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you in Oxford in February. Since the Mongols, Russia uses brute force to exert its power over its subjects and its neighbors. Will this ever change?
So you want a historian to be a prophet?
Yes, because we need profits, because that is the background for all of this. Ukraine's not the problem. It's
Well,
Russia and
yeah.
its imperial, deep imperial commitments. And it's just Putin, sadly.
So getting over the loss of empire historically takes a long time.
Yes.
In the best of countries, and Russia is not the best of countries at the moment. So I think if the implication of your question is we have to be in there for the long haul,
yes,
that for decades to come we will be dealing with the decline of the Russian Empire and its consequences, I couldn't agree more, and we have to be ready for that. I would say with a twin track policy, one of containment, a really strong containment, but also when post-Putin of engagement. But what makes this more complicated is that we are moving into what might very simplistically be called the post-Western world, right? Mm. So we threw at Russia, we threw the kitchen sink at them, unprecedented array of sanctions, and his economy is doing pretty much fine. Partly because he prepared for it, partly because it's a war economy, but above all, because the Indians are buying the oil that we're no longer buying. And China, as we've seen, there's a special relationship between China and Russia, and the economic relationship is very strong. In other words, we have these non-Western powers, your China, your India, your Turkey, your Brazil, your South Africa, which are wealthy and powerful enough to counterbalance us. And many analysts of Russia are saying that at least geopolitically, what's happening with Russia is that it's orienting itself medium to long term away from the West and Europe and towards those other, Eastern and Southern partners. So I think we're in for a long haul. But what is still feasible? Don't get me wrong. What is still feasible is something that can plausibly be called victory on the territory of Ukraine, and so that changes the calculus in Russia too.
But what would that victory be if it was simply just giving breathing space to Putin and his successors?
Well, Big Brzezinski said, Russia with Ukraine is still an empire. Russia without Ukraine is not an empire. Oversimplification, because there are lots of other bits of Russia, of the Russian Federation still, but he has a point. I mean, that's in a way what Putin thinks, that Russia has to have Ukraine to be a great country, to be an empire. So I think one should not underestimate the medium-term consequences of an independent, sovereign Ukraine. Over a number of years, Russia then has to start rethinking its own place in the world if it's no longer an empire as it used to be.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joe, your hand has been up.
Yes, thank you very much. This is the first time I've attended one of your forums, and I'm absolutely delighted, as I'm a great believer in cross-party campaigning and activity towards good relations with Europe. I did put my question in the chat, and it relates to the very early part of the discussion. I've heard the professor recently on Radio 4 a couple of times, and I'm wondering, do you have good relations with the Labour Party? Do they ever consult you? Do they read you? Do they quote you? Because I really think they should.
That's extremely kind of you to say so. I belong to no political party, never have, never will, but
No, so do
I do, I mean, as I talk to leaders of all parties and to people in Labour, I mean, leading people in Labour too. And I think it wouldn't be too much to say that the choice that I was characterizing very simply is one that is being actively discussed at the highest levels of the Labour Party. And I think it's no secret that David Lammy is perhaps the most outspoken advocate of the larger reset. He said it himself. It's very difficult to distinguish between the extreme tactical caution and electoral discipline of Keir Starmer's office, which is very impressive. You know, it's like Fawlty Towers, don't mention the war. You know, don't mention Europe, don't mention Brexit, right? So it's very difficult ultimately to distinguish between that and a genuine caution. And where this, I think, becomes really interesting is in the economic side, right? Because if you want to have the most dynamic economic growth in you know, the OECD or the G7, you know, Rachel Reeves is laying out a plan which is essentially national. But it's absolutely economics, you know, 101, that your relations between your biggest single market are going to affect your economic performance. And so I just don't know whether they are privately confronting that question down the road. I do know that the choice that I've been describing is being actively debated.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Richard, my Lord Needham, Sir Needham. Richard, you need to unmute yourself.
I didn't have any question.
I think
Richard, you're
he
still on mute.
I think he said he didn't have a question. Oh,
No, he's got his hand up. That's why I called him.
yes,
Right.
exactly. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Joe. He's saying something, but the rest of us can't hear him. I apologise for that. I have a question from John.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, Richard, we can. We're delighted to hear
Sorry,
you
so
now.
sorry. I'm technically hopeless. Professor, I have a few Ukrainian friends, not many, but they feel that Crimea is very hard for Russia. That things in Crimea for the Russians are going very badly, and are likely to get worse. And that they've now got the capacity to take out the Kerch Bridge anytime they wanted, and also to stop the Azov railway line. And they think that that is a sort of major area for them to succeed in. Do you go along with that? And the second thing is, are there any sort of occasions when they might use tactical nuclear, the Russians might use tactical nuclear weapons?
So to take the second one first, of course, I don't know any more than anybody else, but there has been fairly reliable reporting, for example, in the FT, that the use of tactical nukes was considered fairly early in the war and rejected on the grounds that it's relatively ineffective, and you know, it messes up the areas in which you're trying to advance, and it doesn't necessarily, you know, bring the Ukrainians to raise the white flag. In the meantime, both China and India, which, as I mentioned, are very, very important partners for Russia, have said, please don't. And particularly China, please don't go through that. So I think we shouldn't be unduly frightened. Of course, it's prudent to consider it, but I think we shouldn't exaggerate the danger of nuclear use. On Crimea, here's the thing. Actually, well, first of all, people forget that the Ukrainians have had one absolutely amazing success, which is that they pushed the Black Sea Fleet pretty much out of Crimea, right to the east. That's an amazing success. You know, the Russian Imperial Fleet has been there for well over a century. So they've already been successful there. What is most feasible and I think desirable is deep strikes using long-range missiles, of which the best would be the Taurus, the German Taurus, if the Germans would only let them have it, but also our own Storm Shadow and the French Scalp, which is actually the same missile, to hit the Russian supply lines through Crimea. And the military guys say that would put real pressure on Russian forces, particularly in southern Ukraine. And so I think that's something we should long ago have encouraged them to do, also to take down the Kerch Bridge, although the Kerch Bridge is incredibly well defended, by the way. Apparently the railway line is more difficult to take out. But so yes, short answer, I think we should encourage them and enable them to do more deep strikes, not to try and actually recapture Crimea, but to hit the supply lines.
Thank you, Timothy. Peter Burke, I'm not being rude in providing your surname, Peter. It's just there are several Peters on this webinar.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Timothy. Very enlightening, if not entirely cheering thought. I've really got a question for you about the extracurricular activities of the Russian armed forces. And I'm thinking particularly about the pipelines in the Baltic and the various possible cyber attacks which we've witnessed. And I suppose most recently in the NHS, and also the various unexplained incidents around Europe, which we hear about in small print, where there have been fires and explosions and so on. Nobody quite knows why. And the finger's been pointed at the Russians. I mean, number one, do you think those accusations are justified? And two, do you think that they deserve a response, or is an appropriate response possible?
One would have to look case by case, but in many of these cases, we have good evidence that it is the Russians behind it. So yes, that's undoubtedly the case. And indeed, I think that that's what escalation looks like. I think it doesn't look like a frontal attack on Estonia. I think it looks like multiple hybrid asymmetric attacks, plus possibly having a go at Moldova. Remember, there's a chunk of Moldova that is Russian occupied. So it's not Estonia, but it might be Moldova. Well, I think we have to improve our own defenses. And I hope we're thinking what we could do ourselves. But of course, we are understandably cautious about getting into a war with Russia, a direct war with Russia. So I think you would have to look case by case carefully at, what the implications would be for our own infrastructure. The other thing, of course, Russia is doing is very effective disinformation. Also in Ukraine. So one of the things I picked up, which I hadn't picked up before on this last visit, was that they are using fluent, perfect Ukrainian speakers from the occupied territories, who they recruit, to spread criticism of Zelensky on Ukrainian social media. And since there's already some critical attitudes to Zelensky, they're just stoking it up. So I think we should also be much, much more, alert and active in what we're doing about disinformation, and indeed, accept that there is an information war going on, and therefore Peter Pomerantsev has written very well about this, and therefore, we have to, not let the devil have all the best tunes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. John, good evening.
Good evening, and I wonder if I could tempt you to look ahead again as a historian, but as an observer of current political scenes, and look at Putin's prospects and whether you would like to speculate on the likelihood or the possibility that he will go down either for health reasons or for political reasons. There's been at least one semi-military, quasi-military attack on him, maybe others to come. And how you see his successors? Are you able to sort of tell us who you think are the likely successors to that? And perhaps the other side of the coin is same is true of Zelensky, of course. If he were to disappear, he's enormously important to Ukrainian morale, but also the global support.
I don't think we should kid ourselves. Putin is pretty firmly in the saddle. And so far as we know, he's not doesn't have any critical health problems. I was talking to the German ambassador to Moscow, who's very well informed, and he said from the point of view of the Russian elite, things are going pretty well. The war is going pretty well. Putin thinks he's winning. He's persona grata in half the world. He's welcomed with the red carpet and open-armed in China. And as I said, the war on the ground, you know, they're grinding forward. So I don't think one should put a high probability on political change in Russia ending Putin and the war. The Prigozhin mutiny was obviously told us something, but it was kind of a one-off, and he has controlled it. But obviously he's mortal, and at some point, particularly if Ukraine wins, you know, he'll go one way or another, probably unpleasantly. And then it's most likely that the immediate succession will go to the Siloviki, to the security apparatus, to the hardliners around him. So this is very unlikely to be a wonderful Democrat who suddenly emerges, right? But then the question becomes, what happens after that? Does Russia really continue with, so to speak, the Eastern option, its Eurasian option, which is where it seems to be heading? Or does it go with a large part of the business elite and the diplomatic elite and the intellectual elite who still look to the West and still look to Europe and might want to? And that is the big unknown. The only thing I would say on that is, in policy terms for us, we have to keep sending the message that another relationship is available. That if we had a different leadership in Russia, there is a quite different relationship to be had with the West, to encourage those parts of the Russian elites who would go the other way. Last thing, I mean, in a year's time, you may quote this back at me, but I think the one thing that is extremely unlikely is any sort of popular revolt. Whatever change comes, I think it's likely to come from the elites.
This is Simon. I know you have a question and you really asked them, so please go ahead.
Thank you, Liz. You mentioned at the beginning about defence procurement, and the EU seems to be evolving defence initiatives that are somewhat unsympathetic to third countries. For example, the European Defence Fund is only fully available to members of the EEA. And now we know sort of the political declaration alluded to UK involvement to an extent, but there isn't any precedent for this or any other examples. So given Labour's red lines, particularly in the single market, how do you see UK-EU cooperation in defence procurement evolving, given all that?
Listen, this is a great question because it's obviously crucial. Here we are, you know, in the front line helping Ukraine, but we're not getting any orders from the EU, from continental Europe. And and the French are very strong on this, of course, that it should be EU internal, and EDF, I think I'm right in saying, allows for a small percentage of non-EU in the suppliers. Of course, defense companies are very complicated creatures, so they sometimes have French arms and Italian arms and German arms and so on. So it's slightly more complicated than that. But of course, the European Peace Facility, the EPF, is not an EU institution. And so if I were making my pitch, which is a big reset, I would include the let's come into the European Peace Facility into that. And that would at least put them on the spot. It would put the question there. And I think there would be strong disagreements inside the EU. So yeah, it's an absolutely crucial point, and one where Britain and France would clearly not be on the same side.
Thank you.
I have two questions sent in by writing. I feel someone's gone off mute. One is from John Firth. John, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, and thank you for a very interesting discussion so far. I just wondered if could Prime Minister Sunak follow a similar approach to your suggestions for Prime Minister Starmer, or what could his approach be?
I mean, absolutely. I think this is approach for a British government in a European geopolitical crisis. So I don't think it's party specific. But on the other hand, of course, it does help to be the new broom. And giving a sense of a new beginning is going to be easier for an incoming. I think we've got some feedback. I think it would be easier for a new incoming government, i.e., Starmer, to do it, and there would be because obviously Brexit happened under the Tories, there would be more kind of suspicions and reservations about it. But there were centre-right governments in continental Europe as well as centre-left ones. So in terms of party relations, can I add one point on that, which is it's kind of important for British politicians to relearn to what I call speak European, by which I mean to frame things in a larger historical context of European history, to maybe refer back to Churchill, to maybe refer back to what we've done together over the last 80 years, and so on and so forth. That actually in international relations within Europe is very, very important. And I don't think, with all respect, Rishi Sunak is very good at speaking European. To be quite honest, I'm not sure how good the Labour leadership is either, although I think Starmer has more of it. It's something actually that Blair was very, very good at the presentational side of it, the diplomatic side of it. And so I think some thought would have to be given to whoever the new government is. I mean, even Sunak, in the unlikely event, dare I say, at how it is reframed.
I think that's an excellent suggestion on language and actually learning to speak in a way that can be acceptable or can start to frame a debate. Thank you very much.
Mahatma Gandhi said we need speech that opens ears. It's a wonderful phrase.
Like it.
More listening than talking. Bryony, your hand is up.
Good evening. It puzzles me that when we are so wealthy, so populous, and so experienced, at least historically speaking, in matters of war, that we can't seem to get our act together. And I wonder if you think that the Swiss have anything to teach us in this matter, because they do keep their menfolk and womenfolk well organized and well trained for any sort of occurrence of a defense kind.
Yeah, well, of course, we long since have not had national service. It's very interesting that now Germany, which has a defense minister who is more popular and actually more effective than its chancellor, Boris Pistorius, is actively advocating a model of national service, which is like the Scandinavian one, where people are available for national service, but they're not necessarily called up. So I think that's a very interesting point to consider. We, of course, for a very long time have not had conscription, so it's not for us. But the other point I would make is, if you look at our defense spending, the arm of the services that's been neglected is clearly the army, right? So we built these enormously expensive aircraft carriers, for example, thinking about Asia Pacific and so on. And if the correct diagnosis is that the principal European security threat for the foreseeable future, also to us, is Russia, it's a continental threat, and that the best answer to it, given that the US is likely to reduce its conventional forces, is to build up particularly our conventional defense capacity, then I think there's a very clear message to us that we should be concentrating more on the army.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that we have 2 minutes left of this session and we're nearly out of time. I have a couple of housekeeping notes, but Timothy, is there anything you would like to say by way of conclusion, or you haven't been invited to ask so far?
There is one gentleman who appears to have a hand up on my screen, but
yes,
is that
yes,
actually?
he does, and he has for a time.
Is that actually?
He's already asked you one question.
Ah, I see. Okay, right. Okay, he's now taking his hand down. It's one of those. I'm very familiar with those hands that stay up. Yes, yes. Well, listen, no, not really. I mean, it was a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. And let me say the final thing, which is about the B word. I actually think we should stop banging on about Brexit. I think that the entire British political conversation should move on from that. I mean, you know my views on Brexit, and I think that the facts speak for themselves. Look at the tables in the FT recently. But that's always going to be divisive for a long time to come. But I think finding a shared framing in terms of having a really constructive relationship with our closest European partners and allies at a time when we all face existential security threats. If we could get to that as a shared framing in British politics, I think that would move us on in a very helpful way.
Thank you very much. And thank you for what I think your closing remarks are a perfect statement of exactly what needs to happen, but that's my personal point of view. Thank you all for attending, and by way of end notes, the CEF AGM is by Zoom, for those who are members, is by Zoom on Wednesday, and the reception we normally have is in person on the 15th of July. And for those of you who are not members but might wish to be, you can join via our website, which is www.conservativeeuropeanforum.com. Thank you all for attending, and particularly grateful thanks to Timothy for a wonderful contribution.
Great
Have a
pleasure.
good evening.